In my last video, I was responding to EdJacobson, and I had mentioned that he had issued something of a challenge. So in case you haven't seen those videos, either his video or my response to it, or in case you're new to this channel, I'll give you a bit of a background on the subject. The main argument that I provide on this channel is called the God is not God argument. It's a description of how we assess intelligence, and it shows that that process by which we assess intelligence, undermines every aspect of the teleological argument. So the teleological argument fails for two basic reasons. First, it completely misunderstands how we identify things that are designed, and second, in correcting its logical structure, it actually implies the non-existence of God. That is, even if we were to follow it to its logical conclusion, it would likely mean that God does not in fact exist. Now, EdJacobson very aptly pointed out that the God is not God argument effectively does something that very few people or other arguments have done in the past, which is address multiple arguments for God's existence simultaneously. And this is a really important thing for us to do because of all the arguments for God's existence, the cosmological, teleological, ontological, moral imperative, all those arguments are said to be in the service of proving the existence of the same being. So it's important to point out when their premises or conclusions are mutually exclusive. The God is not God argument, again, addresses the subject of intelligence by way of showing that we use an obstacle-goal relationship, that is, a relationship between obstacles and goals. Now, the cosmological argument effectively addresses the subject of obstacles, and the ontological argument effectively addresses the subject of goals. The teleological argument attempts to reconcile these relationships in the presence of a complicated universe, and it fails to do so. So the conclusion of the conclusion of the God is not God argument is to use the obstacle-goal relationship to show that it is not possible to demonstrate the existence of a limitless being without describing all of its limits. This is what I call the necessary paradox of theism. It's not just that theists contradict themselves, it's that they have to. EdJacobson's point is that, the point that he had raised is that the God is not God argument is basically addressing the teleological argument in the context of the cosmological argument, by focusing on the difference between intelligence and obstacles. And his challenge to me then was to focus on the other end, to use the obstacle-goal relationship to address the weaknesses of the ontological argument and to show the problems therein. So, and in fact, he had actually done some of this himself in his own video when he had issued the challenge by pointing out that as long as we're going to be ascribing value judgments to certain phenomena and then saying, things like that existence is better than non-existence, therefore the greatest of all beings would exist versus not exist. So EdJacobson said, well, why wouldn't we put a value judgment on nirvana? Why would God be so imperfect as to need anything outside of himself? Why wouldn't he already be in a state of not wanting? But the challenge is actually more complicated than that, which is what makes it interesting to me, because and this is partly one of the reasons why I didn't focus so much on goals in my video series on the subject, because most of the goals that we have actually are themselves the result of some other obstacle-goal relationship. For example, if you ask a person, why do you want to get a good education? They'll say, so I can get a good job. Why do you want to get a good job? So you can get good money. Why do you want to get good money? So you can get a nice house and a nice car and things like that. But even more fundamentally, your body has very specific things that it needs to stay alive. Things like food, water, air, sleep, and things like that. And largely being the product of the selfish genes that produce them, your bodies have very inventive ways of ensuring that your goals align with the goals of your body. For example, if you don't feed yourself, you'll get this biological feedback called hunger pangs, wherein no matter what you're doing for your day, whether you're enjoying it or not, you will be motivated to reprioritize to ensure that you service your body in the way that it needs to make that pain go away. Likewise, if you starve yourself of sleep, your body will give you the feedback that you're tired before it makes you hallucinate, before it shuts you down and makes you go to sleep. So a lot of the things that we do in our daily lives are in service to those two functions. Now, you think about it. How much do you eat out of a given day? Maybe 20 minutes per meal, maybe 3 times a day. That's about an hour. That's 1 hour out of 24. That's 4% of your life. Add to that the 30% that you sleep, 20 to 30 depending on how reckless you are. You're spending most of your waking life in service of those two functions, having something to eat and having somewhere to sleep in. Those two functions are most of our lives. So how would your life be different if your cost of living were zero? If you didn't need to sleep and if you didn't need to eat to stay alive, what else would you be doing with your life? Those are interesting questions to ask. And so the question about the ontological argument is not just a matter of why would God not be in a state of nirvana as much as it is, can he put himself into a state of nirvana? Can he change who he is and the things that limit him in order to change his goals? Because if we changed our limitations, if we had the ability to remove the restrictions on us imposed on us by our biology, if we could be, for lack of a better word, immortal, how different would our lives be? I think they would be significantly different, and the things that we would choose to do would be much different as well. So the question for God, again, is can he change who he is to a degree that allows him to free up his options and to change what he wants to do? Can he put himself into a state of nirvana? Now, in terms of biology, obviously that's not something that is open to us as an option. However, we can change other kinds of goals that we have in our lives. We have these things called psychologists, whose job it is to help us realign our goals when our goals themselves are the things that cause us turmoil and strife in our lives. For example, the other week I was watching an old rerun of a show called Gene Simmons' Family Jewels. Gene Simmons is obviously the rock star from Kiss, and the dilemma that he had is that he had a desire to pursue women constantly, as most men do, and he had the means to do it, so he did it a lot. And he also had a family at home that he wished to go to when he was not on the road, and he wanted everything to be hunky-dory at home, and that's just not how things work. His expectations for life were not compatible with reality. And so he was seeing a psychologist to try to reconcile all this and try to work out his marriage and do all these different things. And ultimately the psychologist had to tell him that it was his expectations for life that were causing him problems, that he had to make a decision between continuing to do what he was doing and lose his family, or choose his family and change the things that he was doing, which involves a change and an adjustment in himself and the desires and the things that he pursues. So these things are manageable. We can do these things. We can change who we are psychologically in a pretty impressive way. We can modify our goals by changing who we are. It is something that is open to us, and we often do this through the help of some external medium, usually a psychologist or some other professional of the sort. Of course, on a lesser scale, you can do the same thing with your finances. Some people have an unhealthy desire to purchase things that are outside their budget, and a budget expert can sit down with them, not a psychologist obviously, but someone can sit down with them, go through the facts and say, hey, maybe you don't really need that kind of car, maybe you don't need that business suit to walk around to maintain your social status, things like that. So there are ways in which we can adjust our goals by changing who we are fundamentally. So again, the question is, can God do that? Or does he somehow need a psychologist to help him through that process? I mean, does he really need to sit down with a Tibetan monk to learn something about attaining a state of happiness? Now, interestingly enough, and as I would expect with the necessary paradox of theism, is that a lot of Christians will actually say that this is not an option towards God. That is, for example, you can ask a Christian, can God not be a loving God? And they will tell you no, that is not an option. That is part of his nature. Now, whenever a Christian or some other theist mentions God's nature, they are referring to limitations that they have arbitrarily imposed on God, as I predict. It is, again, a limitation that they have to impose on him in order to justify the complexity of the universe that we see. So, and again, that is itself a manifestation of having to demonstrate God's intelligence, which goes back to the God is not God argument. So again, the obstacle-goal relationship highlights the weaknesses in the ontological argument in its ability to highlight the inability of a believer to explain why the universe would exist at all, because they cannot address why God would have goals outside of attaining a state of nirvana. So I hope that addresses everything. If you guys have any questions, let me know. But I hope this has been interesting and insightful. So thanks for watching.